Robert, fantastic to have you here. We're going to get right into this. What are some of the signs, if people are listening or watching this now, that people can be aware of that can signal that they're eating too much sugar?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, that's everyone. In fact, we're supposed to consume 6 to 9 teaspoons of added sugar maximum. Obviously, lower is better. Our current median consumption is actually 17 and a half in the United States. It's about 15 here in the UK. So pretty much everybody is consuming too much sugar. And it's not because they're spooning, one lump or two, into their coffee or tea. It's because of the consumption of ultra-processed foods. Now, obviously, what are the symptoms is what you're asking. Well, first of all, craving. Anybody who says, oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth, that's sugar addiction until proven otherwise. And people don't understand that. People think, well, sugar is just empty calories. No, in fact, sugar activates the reward center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, and everything that activates the reward center in the extreme is addictive. So we have chemical addictions, cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar. We have behavioral addictions, shopping, gambling, internet gaming, social media, pornography. There's an aholic after every one of those. Chocoholic, shopaholic, sexaholic, alcoholic, etc. The fact of the matter is, sugar activates the nucleus accumbens and it activates dopamine. Therefore, in the extreme, it is addictive. Now, is it addictive in everyone? Is alcohol addictive in everyone? No. 40% of Americans are teetotalers, never touch the stuff. 40% are social drinkers, can pick it up, put it down, no problem. I'm in that group. 10% are binge drinkers, and 10% are chronic alcoholics. Now, how do you know which one you are? Well, about the same for how do you know whether you're a sugar addict or not. What I can say is that people who are sugar addicted tend to be irritable, tend to be fatigued, tend to be a little bit, shall we say, impulsive, a little bit angry, a little bit ADD, if you will. And of course, the main way is they tend to be very tired and they gain weight. And when they gain weight, they tend to gain weight in their liver and of course in their visceral fat. So their waist size will go up. So those are the kind of symptomatology profile, if you will. In children, we see irritability and difficulty concentrating. In middle schoolers, sugar consumption has been associated with violent behaviors. In Boston middle schoolers, certainly it's been associated with depression and other psychiatric symptoms as well.
I want to talk about addiction in a bit more detail here, because I'm of the opinion that you can be a holic of all these different substances or behaviors. The traditional description of addiction is that you have withdrawal effects. We definitely see that with sugar. There are people on the other side that have a differing opinion that sugar is not addictive.
Yes, I know.
What are those opinions, and what are your rebuttals to some of those?
So there is a group here in the UK and in Europe called Neurofast, and they believe that in fact the problem is not food addiction, the problem is eating addiction. Well, if that's the case, then there's no specific food that is addictive. Well, what that does is that gives the industry carte blanche to basically put anything they want in. When you look at what they say, first of all, they give alcohol a pass, and then they give caffeine a pass. And well, alcohol, caffeine, like sugar is not addictive, but alcohol and caffeine are, but you're giving them a pass. Like, how does that work?
Yeah.
They also say sugar is energy and it's necessary for life. garbage. Where does that come from? Now, it is true that glucose is energy. It is true that your liver can metabolize glucose for energy, and so can your brain, and so can every other organ in your body. That's true. But the question is, do your organs need glucose? And the answer is, they need it, but you don't have to consume it to get it, because your body will make it. It will make it out of protein or fat, a process called gluconeogenesis. So, yes, you need glucose, but you don't need to eat glucose. Fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, there is no biochemical reaction in the body that requires it. It is completely vestigial to all animal life on this planet, and it is a mitochondrial toxin. It inhibits 3 enzymes that are necessary for mitochondria to work properly. It inhibits AMP kinase, the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, which is one of the enzymes that helps chop up the fatty acids into 2 carbon fragments so that they can be oxidized. And also the byproduct of fructose metabolism, uric acid, inhibits carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, which is necessary to regenerate carnitine, which is the shuttle mechanism to get the fatty acids into the mitochondria for oxidation in the first place.
Okay.
In other words, fructose is a chronic dose-dependent mitochondrial toxin. So the fact that it has 4 calories per gram is kind of irrelevant. In the same way that alcohol has 7 calories per gram and is kind of irrelevant. There's no dietitian on the planet who would call alcohol food. Well, there should be no dietitian on the planet that calls sugar food, because it's not necessary. It is not a nutrient. Just because it's energy doesn't make it a nutrient. In fact, sugar is not food. Okay? The definition of food. What is the definition of food? Substrate that contributes either to growth or burning of an organism. Well, I've just shown you that sugar actually inhibits burning because it inhibits mitochondrial ATP generation. How about growth? My colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsenigo Ornan at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, head of the Department of Nutrition, has shown that sugar actually impairs linear growth. It impairs cortical growth. It impairs trabecular growth. All right? It hijacks growth. It promotes cancer growth through fermentation, through the Warburg effect, but it in fact actually inhibits growth. So if a substrate actually inhibits burning and inhibits growth, is it a food? In fact, sugar is not a food. Sugar is a food additive.
Okay.
That's what sugar is.
Yeah.
And we have plenty of data to support food additive addiction. So this is where the argument becomes actually not just semantic.
Yeah.
Food versus eating addiction. Ultimately, what we're talking about is food additive addiction. And that's one of the things I'm trying to, promote and get across to both the public and to NeuroFast, because, they got to get with the friggin' program.
And with the just on that point around food addiction, I think it also comes down to how socially acceptable some of these items are.
Indeed.
If you take the glib example of smoking, it was very socially acceptable 60, 70 years ago, and it took decades for it to become socially unacceptable. And
Absolutely.
I think we're still at the early stages when it comes to sugar as an additive.
I couldn't agree with you more, Rupi. I mean, smoking went from fashion to filthy habit
Yeah.
in 30 years. Okay? Now, how did that happen? And why did it take 30 years? And the answer is, we taught the children. The children grew up. And they voted. And the naysayers are all dead. Okay? This is a generational shift. And unfortunately requires a generation to be able to see it. In the fact, we have had 4 cultural tectonic shifts, both in the US and UK, over the last 30 years, and here they are. Number one, bicycle helmets and seatbelts.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, smoking in public places. Number three, drunk driving. Number four, condoms in bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Each of those was basically third rail of politics 30 years ago. If a legislator had stood up in a state house or Congress or Parliament or the Duma or anywhere else in the world and promoted any legislation about any one of those four things, they'd have gotten laughed right out of town.
Mm-hmm.
Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my car. Today, they're all facts of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
No one's belly aching about any of those. Okay. Oh, we're belly aching about new stuff like COVID vaccines. I mean, it's not like we'll ever solve this issue, but those four, they're settled. There's no arguments about. You see anybody protesting seatbelts today? Lord Balfour in 1980 stood up in Parliament right across the street over here, okay, and basically told everybody that seatbelts were an affront against their personal liberty. I mean, let's get real here.
Yeah.
All right. This takes a generational shift, and we've done it, and we'll do it with sugar. We're about, I would say, 10 years into the 30-year cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. And it does feel like it's quite early in this journey of changing perceptions socially around sugar. And I guess, one of the other things I think is quite important to distinguish is the different types of sugars that we have in our food supply. We mentioned ultra-processed foods, but maybe we could use the example of a whole food that contains natural sugars like fructose, like an apple, let's say, and a juice, which is somewhere along that processing, and then something where you have an apple-like substance added to something that's wrapped and you'll find in a candy bar or whatever. And walk us through sort of what the body receives in those three silly examples.
So, people always say to me, Dr. Lustig, you are so full of crap. Okay, because what you're basically telling us is don't eat fruit. And I never said that. In fact, eat all the fruit you want as long as it's fruit. Okay, so what's the difference between fruit and fruit juice? Okay, big difference. And the answer is the fiber. Now, people think fiber is what you throw in the garbage after you've juiced the fruit. In fact, the fiber is the reason to consume the fruit in the first place. The juice is nature's way of getting you to eat your fiber. So, why is fiber important? So, fiber is important for 6 different reasons. The first is it gives you a feeling of fullness. So it tells your brain you've eaten something, which is necessary to help start the mechanisms of satiety. It doesn't induce satiety, but it helps, sort of mitigate and modulate the amount you eat. The second thing it does, the soluble and insoluble fiber within the fruit, and you need both. Soluble fiber is like pectins or inulin, like what holds jelly together. Insoluble fiber is cellulose, like the stringy stuff in celery, or cardboard for that matter. Okay? When you consume the whole fruit, you're getting both. And what happens is that the insoluble fiber sets up a lattice work, a fishnet, if you will, on the inside of your intestine. And the soluble fiber are globular. They plug the holes in the fishnet like kelp would. And together, they form an impenetrable secondary barrier that prevents absorption of glucose, fructose, sucrose, simple starches from getting from the intestinal lumen into the bloodstream. So you are delaying the absorption. You are delaying the glycemic response. Therefore, you are delaying the insulinemic response, and you're attenuating it. And it's all about keeping that insulin down, because insulin's the bad guy in this story. It's the thing that both drives weight gain and chronic metabolic disease. Anything you can do to keep your insulin down is good. And fiber is the best way to keep your insulin down. So when you're consuming the fruit, you're getting that second effect of the soluble and insoluble fiber, mitigating the glucose and insulin rise. Well, if you're not absorbing it early, it goes further down the intestine where the microbiome will chew it up for its purposes. So you are feeding the gut. And it turns out that that gut will take that fiber, and will turn it into short-chain fatty acids, which are shown to be anti-inflammatory, anti-Alzheimer's. And lastly, the fiber will act like little scrubbies on the inside of your colon, preventing colon cancer. So 6 benefits to consuming the fruit as a whole fruit, but not because of the glucose, not because of the fructose, but rather because of the fiber. So eat the fruit, don't drink the juice. Now, then we get to soda, or worse.
Yeah.
And then you've got a whole nother, level of toxicity.
Yeah, because with the juice, you're getting some, let's say, polyphenols that you have in apple with the fiber
Sure.
mitigated, so you can make an argument that there is some benefit, although it still will spike your blood sugar.
So if you juice a fruit, you will still have soluble fiber. Soluble fiber, the globular soluble fiber will still be there. And that does have some metabolic benefit. It will still generate short-chain fatty acids, okay? It still has a benefit. But of the 6 benefits that I just described, you will only get 2 of them. So you're shortchanging yourself when you do that. So I am not for juicing.
Okay.
I know that the rest of the world thinks, magic bullets are magic.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
And does that go hand in hand with smoothies, or is that
Same
further
thing.
up there? Same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to sugar-sweetened beverages or sodas, because this is a main line to the liver, I guess.
Indeed.
Yeah. So talk us through what happens when you have a high fructose corn syrup sweetened sugar beverage, or
well, sir, first of all, sucrose, table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, the stuff you put in your coffee, is what you have in your UK Coca-Cola. High fructose corn syrup is what we have in our US Coca-Cola. Does it matter? Not a bit. They are exactly the same. Now, technically, they're not the same. Sucrose is 1 glucose, 1 fructose with an O-glycosidic linkage linking the two. So it's a disaccharide. High fructose corn syrup is 1 glucose, 1 fructose, not bound together with that O-glycosidic linkage. So they are free. So they are monosaccharides. So people seem to think that means something. No, it doesn't. It means nothing, because the enzyme sucrase in your intestine will cleave that O-glycosidic linkage bond in about a nanosecond. You absorb the 2 molecules separately, and they both go to the liver and do what we talked about. Basically, if you overwhelm your liver's capacity to metabolize fructose, the mitochondria, who are being inhibited, right, as we just discussed, have no choice but to take the excess and turn it into liver fat. This is a process called de novo lipogenesis, new fat making. And fructose drives that de novo lipogenesis. And then that fat is sitting in the liver and has one of 2 fates. It can either be exported out as a VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, which you measure in your serum triglyceride, and can serve as a substrate either for obesity or for cardiovascular disease, or that fat molecule, molecule won't make it out at all and will precipitate in the liver as liver triacylglycerol, as a lipid droplet. And now you have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which predisposes you to diabetes and every other chronic metabolic disease. So either way, it's a problem. If you overwhelm your mitochondria, you will make liver fat. And there are 4 things that overwhelm mitochondria: fructose, alcohol, trans fats, and branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine. They are metabolized the same way. And because of that, when they are deamidated, they become branched chain organic acids. They overwhelm the mitochondria, and the mitochondria has no choice but to turn those into fat as well. This is work of Christopher Newgard at Duke. So it's not that I'm fructocentric. It's that I'm hepatocentric. The liver is where the action is.
Yeah.
And anything that overloads your liver mitochondria becomes a toxin. Even things that we call food.
Let's give listeners and viewers some insight into why the liver is one of your focal points, because
Indeed.
I don't think many people grasp just how prominent and prevalent NAFLD is in the States, and also burgeoning in the UK, particularly in a younger cohort.
Yes. I mean, this is a disease that was never diagnosed before 1980. So prior to 1980, if you saw fat in the liver on either an ultrasound or electron microscopy of the, of a liver biopsy, okay, that was an alcoholic. Okay, the only place you saw fatty liver was an alcoholic. Okay, well today, okay, 20% of 5-year-olds have fatty liver.
20%.
20% of 5-year-olds, not obese 5-year-olds, 5-year-olds. All right, 45% of the adult American population has fatty liver disease. This was a disease that had never existed before 1980, and now 45% of America has it. You want to talk about pandemics? This is the friggin' pandemic, and no one is talking about it. Now, why does it matter? The answer is because that fat is making the liver not do its job. That fat is generating a phenomenon called insulin resistance. It is preventing the ability of the liver to respond to the insulin signal. Now, the pancreas releases insulin in response to the glucose level. The insulin drains from the pancreas. Now, normally when a gland releases a hormone, it goes into the systemic circulation. And the volume of distribution of the systemic circulation is 6 liters. So a little insulin will get diluted throughout the body if it went into the systemic circulation, but it doesn't. It goes straight to the liver through the portal vein. And the volume of distribution of the portal vein is about 250 milliliters, not 6 liters. So a little insulin drives a very high insulin concentration in that portal vein. So when your liver is not working right, your pancreas has to make more insulin to make the liver do its job. Well, that's going to raise insulin levels at the level of the liver in order to get that liver to do its job. And that's going to end up raising insulin levels throughout the body. This generates hyperinsulinemia. This generates fat deposition. This generates chronic metabolic disease at the level of coronary arteries in terms of coronary vascular smooth muscle proliferation. It's going to generate insulin resistance at the level of the brain, starting the process of Alzheimer's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the liver is the nidus for chronic metabolic disease. When the liver gets sick, all of the organs downstream of the liver get sick as well. So the liver is a primary target, both for the disease process and also for therapeutics.
Yeah. And in terms of biomarkers for insulin resistance, obviously type 2 diabetes, we use things like HbA1c. These are things that are quite further along and downstream in terms of when we see the red flag.
Yeah. I mean, every one of the things you just mentioned, Rupi, the horse is already out of the barn. Those are late markers. So the question is, well, what are the early markers? I mean, how can you catch this, nip it in the bud? And the answer is the best test is a fasting insulin level. And I am here in the UK in part to get the NHS to get their friggin' act together, okay, and start drawing fasting insulins. Now, this is not a slam dunk. And the reason it's not a slam dunk is because the American Diabetes Association, and also Diabetes UK, I should add, do not believe in this. Okay, so why is it that the ADA says one thing and I say the exact opposite? Because I'm right and they're wrong. That's why. All right, now let me explain why that's true. The ADA says don't draw fasting insulin for 2 reasons, and both of them are specious. Both of them are incorrect. The first, they say fasting insulin levels are not, the assay is not standardized across platforms. That is true. I don't argue that. That is absolutely true. Radioimmunoassay, ELISA, MRS, different ways to measure insulin, not standardized. I agree with that. Turns out there is another species that is picked up in the insulin assay. It's called proinsulin. So from your medical schooling, you know that your pancreas makes a peptide called proinsulin, and then an enzyme called prohormone convertase 1 cleaves a piece of peptide out of that proinsulin called C-peptide, and then you make the mature insulin molecule, and then the mature insulin molecule gets secreted in a vesicle from the pancreas. Proinsulin only has 5% of the activity of the mature insulin molecule. It's a prohormone. It's not really an active hormone. Well, when your pancreas is under duress, when you have a high glucose level and you got to get it down and you're significantly insulin resistant, your pancreas can't wait. Okay? And so it's not going to wait for that PC1 to cleave out that C-peptide. It's going to release the whole friggin' molecule. And so you will end up with hyperproinsulinemia. This was actually work by Dr. John S. Yudkin, not John Yudkin, the famous British nutritionist physiologist of the 1970s, the one who argued with Ansel Keys. This is his cousin, John S. Yudkin.
Oh, his actual cousin. Oh, right.
Yeah, the cousin. A wonderful guy. I've met him several times. He's a major force in the field, and I tip my hat to him. Okay, but hyperproinsulinemia. Well, turns out the insulin assay will often pick up both. So the American Diabetes Association says, well, don't draw it. I mean, you're basically measuring two species at once. That's true. Who cares? It's high. That's what matters. All right. And if you got treatment, it would go down, and you could monitor that. So I think that's a specious argument. I just think the ADA is just off base. Second reason they say don't draw it. They say fasting insulin levels do not correlate with obesity. That is also true. It correlates with metabolic health.
Okay.
And there are plenty of obese people who are metabolically healthy, and there are plenty of thin people who are metabolically ill. That's right. It doesn't correlate with obesity. It correlates with metabolic health. That's exactly the reason to draw it. So the reason they say not to draw it is actually the reason to draw it. So the ADA, you got your head up, you know where, and I'll debate you any moment you would like, okay? In any forum you choose, and I'm going to win.
Is there a cost consideration with fasting insulin at all, or is that a moot point?
$14.50 in America.
Wow. Okay. And if it's that in America, it's probably going to be cheaper over here.
Probably.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Are there other markers that we can be looking at in the interim whilst we don't have fasting insulin as the standard across the NHS? Right.
So there are some other metabolites that and intermediaries that are valuable. Uric acid is very valuable. Now, the problem with uric acid is the normal range. So uric acid, as I said, is a byproduct of fructose metabolism. So it goes from fructose 1-phosphate. Okay, when fructose gets phosphorylated to fructose 1-phosphate, ATP goes to ADP, then ADP goes to AMP, which goes to IMP, finally to uric acid. So uric acid will go up. Now, normally we think of uric acid as being associated with purines, with meat. It's also associated with sugar, both. Right? So it's a proxy for sugar consumption. And uric acid levels should be less than 5.5. But if you look at the lab slip, it'll tell you that the upper limit of normal is 7. Now, why is that? Why is 5.5 my upper limit and the lab slip's upper limit is 7? The answer is because the entire curve has shifted to the right over the last 40 years. Because everyone has metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
Because 93% of Americans are metabolically unfit. That's why. All right. And so basically, how do you determine a normal range? You take 10,000 specimens from people who say they're healthy. You figure out the mean and 2 standard deviations, and you draw the line. All right. Well, if everyone's sick, the whole curve has shifted to the right. So 5.5 is actually the upper limit of normal for uric acid. And that's a relatively earlier marker. The second one is ALT, alanine aminotransferase. So this is a marker for liver fat. Again, same issue. What's the normal range? Normal range is up to 25. Now, on the lab slip, normal range is up to 40.
Yeah.
Same issue. Over the last 40 years, it has moved from 25 to 40. When I started medical school in 1976, the upper limit was 25. It's now 40 because everyone's got fatty liver. So these are two markers that are valuable and cheap and in a standard chem panel that you can use, but you have to be able to interpret them properly. And the first thing you have to do is get rid of the highs and the lows. I don't know about here with the NHS, but in America, that high-low, the H and the L, in that column, that's worth $10. That's an interpretation. Okay,
Yeah.
they get to charge more for that.
Oh, really?
Oh, really?
Oh, wow. I didn't
Yeah,
know that.
tell me about it.
No.
Yeah, blow my brains out. But this is the way it is. Right?
Wow. Wow.
So those are valuable. Another thing that's valuable is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. That's a marker for insulin resistance. Right? And, by the time you're waiting for fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C, horse is out of the barn.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of HbA1c, that's specifically looking at glycated hemoglobin with glucose.
That is particularly looking at glycated hemoglobin at position 1 with glucose. Now, not the whole hemoglobin molecule, just position 1, the lysine at position 1. If you want to do a glycohemoglobin, then you're getting the whole thing, but virtually everyone does A1C now.
Yeah.
The point is that fructose also fructates hemoglobin, but it doesn't do it at position 1. It does it at positions 66 and 110, and we don't have a setup for measuring that properly. That's a research tool.
Ah, gotcha. And so do you think there's ever a point in the future where we could get some sight over that, and would that be useful, particularly as fructose is in our food supply?
That's a really good question, and I can't answer that. The Japanese have done that in a research setting and shown that it occurs. Whether or not it will end up having clinical relevance and help us in any meaningful fashion, I would have to see data, and we're still waiting for that.
Give us an insight into some of the foods that might have hidden sources of sugar in, because I'm always asked about, okay, which food should I avoid? And there's the obvious ones, but there's perhaps some less obvious choices that people aren't as aware of when it comes to sugar.
It's everywhere. I mean, it's just everywhere. There's the obvious, the sugar sweetened beverages, that's 37%. There's the candy cakes, ice cream, that's 16%. That leaves 49% of your sugar consumption in things you didn't know had it. Yogurt. Breakfast cereal is a huge one. Salty snacks, peanuts, barbecue potato chips, and the list goes on and on and on and on. I mean, Chinese chicken salad is dessert.
Yeah.
Okay? All right? That's the way you have to think about it. If a sugar is any one of the first 3 ingredients, that is dessert.
Yeah.
And that's how you have to think of it.
In your clinical experience, I remember hearing you talk about how you show parents to how you practically remove sugar from their diets, but also their kids' diets as well.
Right.
I wonder if you could perhaps give us some anecdotes of what those children and adults would experience when they removed sugar after, let's say, 30 days.
Right. So in 2010 to 2014, we performed a study that we've now published 5 papers on, where we took obese kids with metabolic syndrome from our own clinic at UCSF. So Latino and African American, all high sugar consumers, all with metabolic syndrome, obesity plus at least one comorbidity. We figured out what they were eating at home on their home diet. We studied them on their home diet. And then for the next 9 days, we catered their meals. No added sugar. We took the percent calories of added sugar from 28% down to 10%. We gave them fruit. That was their only source of sucrose,
Mm-hmm.
was fruit. Everything else, we wiped out the added sugar in the food. Now, if you do that, if you go from 28 to 10%, you're removing 350 to 400 calories a day out of the kid's diet. And if you do that for 10 days, kid might lose weight. We didn't want them to lose weight. We actually want them to stay the same weight or even gain weight, because we knew the critics would say, well, of course the kid got better, the kid lost weight.
Yeah.
You know, so what? We didn't want them to lose weight. We needed them to stay the same or gain. So we had to replace the 350 to 400 calories a day of sugar that we had taken out with something that was equicaloric. We gave them extra starch. So in the vernacular, we took the pastries out, we put the bagels in. We took the sweetened yogurt out, we put the baked potato chips in, we took the chicken teriyaki out, we put the turkey hot dogs in. So we didn't give them good food, we gave them crappy food. We gave them processed food. We gave them food from local supermarket, Safeway, okay? Food you can buy, but, you know, not necessarily the food the kid would normally choose directly, but parents were okay with it because it was, you know, Safeway food. They could get it themselves if they needed to, but we supplied it. And we gave them a scale. And every day we'd call them up, what'd you weigh? And if they were losing weight, eat more, you know, in order to maintain their weight stability over the course of the 10 days. And then we studied them again 10 days later in their fructose restricted state. Every aspect of their metabolic health improved with no change in calories and no change in weight.
10 days.
22% reduction in liver fat, 46% reduction in the conversion of sugar to fat in the liver, 49% reduction in triglyceride levels, 7% reduction in visceral fat, and most importantly, their pancreas started working right.
Wow.
Their pancreatic secretion and their insulin sensitivity all improved. In other words, we reversed their metabolic syndrome with no change in calories, no change in weight, showing this was not about the quantity of the food, it was about the quality of the food. And that sugar was indeed a direct, chronic, dose-dependent mitochondrial toxin.
And that should have been perhaps not the nail in the coffin for the calories in, calories out argument, but certainly, you know, enough evidence for us to change our thinking at an industry level around calories in, calories out.
Well, the food industry does not want to change.
Yeah.
The food industry, you know, the energy balance model, the calories in, calories out model, that's how they got here. That's their gravy train. Because they say, well, you know, you get to choose what calories you want, and everyone has discretionary calories. And if you want to spend them on sugar, you know, you should be allowed to. So they subscribe to the energy balance model because it's good for them. Now, just so happens there are several other models. One is called the carbohydrate insulin model, that it's the refined carbohydrate and sugar because of the insulin rise. And I, thus far, have subscribed to that. This, of course, has also been promulgated by my colleague at Boston Children's, Dr. David Ludwig. I'm Lustig, he's Ludwig. Someday we're going to open a law firm.
Yeah.
Turns out there's a third model called the redox model, which has to do with oxidation reduction abnormalities in reactive oxygen species that ultimately leads to false metabolic signaling within cells and leads to proton leak, which leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, which is related to the two models, but different. And then finally, most recently, we've developed the obesogen model, specific chemicals in the environment, like bisphenol A and phthalates and, you know, PFAS, you know, polyfluorinated alkylated substances like Teflon, that also, you know, generate obesity as well. And it turns out what they all have in common, all the models, all four models, is reactive oxygen species. Oxidative stress. Oxidative stress, by sending false signals to cells, tell the cells to basically metabolize differently because the cell thinks there's a proton leak. And so it thinks it needs to shut down its mitochondria.
That's fascinating.
And so we're trying to unify the various hypotheses and try to get rid of the calorie. The calorie needs to die.
Yeah.
Okay? My job is to kill the calorie, because the calorie is what the food industry hides behind.
Yeah. And I guess in addition to that, and I know you've touched on this in the past, it's what about stress?
Yeah.
And
What
sugar
about
and
stress?
fat? Yeah.
So stress does several things. Number one, it causes insulin resistance on its own. Cortisol is a primary driver of insulin resistance. Cortisol is also a primary driver of amygdala activity. And one of the ways to try to mitigate increased amygdala activity is with food, but higher density food. So it increases appetite, right? And so stress basically makes everything worse. In addition, stress puts your prefrontal cortex to sleep, puts it into suspended animation. So any cognitive control that you might have had over your diet goes out the window as soon as you are chronically stressed. And so your amygdala just goes hog wild and, says, feed me in order to feel good, so that you can get a rewards, system generation at the level of the nucleus accumbens.
Yeah.
So my colleague in Paris and I, his name is Dr. Philippe Gossier. He's a robotics professor and a neuroscientist, an interesting portfolio. He and I have been working for the past 3 years on a computational model of the limbic system. And basically it all comes down to the amygdala.
Wow.
The fear center.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things that alter that amygdala. And cortisol, obviously, that it's ground zero for what's going on. And so when your amygdala is under attack, okay, all hell breaks loose. And basically that's what's happened to our society in the last 50 years.
Yeah. I mean, as a general practitioner and even someone working in A&E, it's definitely something that I specifically ask and look for whenever somebody is complaining of a weight-related issue or a metabolical issue. I think that's an important consideration.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you're stressed, you can't fix it.
Yeah.
You gotta unstress. So the question, of course, is how do you do that?
Yeah. And there's the problem. Hey.
And that is where individual, personalized medicine really comes in.
Absolutely.
Is because everyone's got a different reason for their stress.
Yeah.
And there's no one size fits all for that.
Yeah. Talking of collaborators, you've collaborated with a colleague of mine, Rachel Gow, on ultra processed food, the metabolic matrix. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit more about ultra processed foods and the impact on metabolic health.
So as I said, ultra processed food is not food for the reasons that we've just discussed. There is a company in the Middle East, the Nestle of the Middle East, if you will. It's called KDD. Kuwaiti Danish Dairy Company, and they make all sorts of crap. They make flavored yogurts, they make frozen, ice cream, they make flavored milks, they make confectionery, biscuits, tomato sauces. Okay, look, the CEO and founder of KDD is a Kuwaiti national born in the UK, who fed Kuwait through the first Gulf War. And Queen Elizabeth knighted him.
Wow.
So he is Sir Muhammad. So how many Sir Muhammads do you know?
Not many.
He is a wonderful guy.
Okay.
An absolute, he is a prince. The guy is an absolute, a stand-up guy. I love him. Okay. But Sir Muhammad, eating his own food, weighed 350 pounds and had type 2 diabetes and back pain at age 48.
Wow. Yeah.
And so he went to his UK doctors, and his UK doctors gave him insulin and oral hypoglycemics, and he got worse. And he felt awful. And so he said, I've got to figure out what to do. So he started going on the internet and doing his own, research. And he found Jason Fung and me. Jason is an adult nephrologist in Toronto who has seen enough diabetic nephropathy in his day and has, glommed on to intermittent fasting as a primary, therapeutic tool. Fair enough. and found me. And anyway, he started doing what we said, and he lost 100 pounds. His type 2 diabetes went away. His back pain resolved, and he thinks we hung the moon. Okay, that's all good. And then he has his aha moment, his moment of epiphany. Wait a second. If I did this to myself, eating my own crap, what am I doing to the rest of the Middle East? And so he talked with his sister, who was the chief financial officer, and they agreed. Since they're privately held, they don't have Wall Street quarterly reports, they don't have shareholders to placate, that they would take the long view, and they wanted to turn their company around and make it metabolically healthy. Now, how do you do that? So they called me, and they said, we would like to engage you in a long-term project to help us develop the method for being able to make processed food healthy. Now, initially, when I heard that, I thought to myself, that's a fool's errand. That ain't going to happen. But, the more I thought about it, I said, there are certain principles that we could certainly make things better. And so I convened a scientific advisory team, Dr. Gao, fatty acid expert, Dr. Tim Harlan, who's head of culinary medicine at George Washington University.
Well. Yeah.
Wonderful guy. Love him. Okay. Best dressed doctor in
Yeah,
America.
he is. Yeah.
I love it. I love Tim. He's like my bro.
Yeah.
Wolfram Alderson, my social media director, and has been in the food business for a long time. And Andreas Kornstadt from Hamburg, who is a computer data scientist, Stanford trained. And we convened the five of us, and we developed a protocol, a set of tiers criteria. KDD, submitted all of their various ingredients for chemical analysis by the company Eurofins. And basically what we did was, over the course of the 3 years of the project, we developed the roadmap for being able to take a company and take the item, the 180 items, the 180 SKUs in this company, and turn them around to be metabolically healthy. And to KDD's credit, 10% of their portfolio has turned around.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
That's like in my mind, that's almost like the pinnacle of your career. Everything that you've been doing and working up to this point is changing the giants that produce, 80-90% of our foods?
Indeed. And the point is that obviously if KDD alone does it, it goes nowhere. But, that's why we told KDD at the beginning of the project that our goal was to publish this. This had to reach, the general public, so that it could be used as a template for other companies to be able to do the same thing. And that was, inherent in our initial agreement. And so we published this in Frontiers in Nutrition back on March 30th. It's called The Metabolic Matrix, Re-engineering Ultra-Processed Food to Protect the Liver, Feed the Gut, and Support the Brain.
This is wonderful. I'm getting sort of like goosebumps, because if you're creating the playbook for a company the size, perhaps it's not as big as Nestle or...
Well, it's not as big as Nestle. It's big enough.
It's big enough to demonstrate to the bigger players that this is possible and this is the direction of travel.
Scalable, and profitable.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I always think, these large companies get a bad rap for good reason, but they were tasked with creating portable, long shelf life, palatable foods and distributing them at a global scale. And they've done that fantastically at the expense of metabolic health.
That's
at the
correct.
Expense of our
Metabolic health was the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you're demonstrating that you can do all those things plus metabolic health, that's phenomenal. That's really going to have a massive impact on health across the world.
And that's the goal.
Brilliant. And how, it's probably going to be very involved, but how did you manage to get 10% of their entire SKU to be metabolically healthy? Was it the addition of
Oh no, we've gotten their whole SKU to be metabolically healthy.
whole
They've just
SKU?
well,
Oh,
they've just been able to initiate. I mean, they have to go slow.
Uh-huh.
Number one, it means trade-offs in terms of vendors. It means trade-offs in terms of procedures. It means trade-offs in terms of machinery. It means trade-offs in terms of marketing and packaging. This is not something that you just snap your fingers and all of a sudden it's done. Okay, it has to be phased, and so they've been able to do this thus far with 10%. The goal is for the whole line to ultimately change. And the most important thing, and this is kind of weird, but the most important thing was they didn't tell the public about it.
Interesting. So
because if they told the public about it, they say, doesn't taste good. Right? Every time you say something's healthy, it doesn't taste good. It's like an automatic.
Yeah.
When you don't tell the public, they don't know the difference.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I mean, Alicia Crum, I believe, in Stanford University, she's done studies about the perception of healthy foods, and people immediately make the assumption that it's not going to taste nice.
That's right.
If it's got a health.
That's right. Tom Robinson took the same hamburger and wrapped it in two different, wrapped it in a McDonald's wrapper, wrapped it in a brown paper wrapper, and automatically the one in the McDonald's wrapper tasted better. I mean, this is, play on your brain.
Yeah. And was it with the addition of things like functional fibers to the original products, or is it a real sort of rewriting the
No, we're adding fibers to things that normally didn't have fiber. We're adding fatty acids, omega-3s to things that didn't have omega-3s. So there's a lot of additions. There's a few subtractions. We're getting rid of the emulsifiers. We're getting rid of a lot of the artificial colors because they generate reactive oxygen species.
Interesting. And price?
It's a little, excuse me, it's a little bit more expensive. What we learned was you can't get rid of all the sugar. If you go straight to non-caloric sweeteners, it doesn't taste very good. Rupi, have you ever tasted a no sugar chocolate bar?
I don't believe I have, although I may have tried. Oh no, I did. I've tried a diabetic bar before. It wasn't very nice.
Yeah, right. It wasn't very nice. Exactly right. It wasn't very nice. You would never go back for a second one if you had a choice, would you?
No.
That's right. All right. Fact of the matter is, you need a little sugar to activate that nucleus accumbens, to make it rewarding. The question is how much? So we had to walk the fine line between activation of the nucleus accumbens and not overloading the liver. 1 teaspoon per serving. 1 teaspoon. 1 teaspoon will get you the nucleus accumbens effect without the liver effect. Okay, 1 teaspoon per serving. That's not enough for an ice cream. That's not enough for a flavored milk. What we learned was we could use a sugar extender beyond that. One that has metabolic benefits of its own. The one that we have chosen, the one that we think is going to be the winner in this non-nutritive sweetener battle is allulose.
Allulose, okay.
Allulose. And allulose has some very promising metabolic health benefits, including lowering of LDL, raising of HDL. Looks good. Don't see any, toxicities at the moment. It's an epimer of fructose. It's metabolized appropriately as opposed to generating, byproducts like aspartame and stuff like that. Not good. Problem right now is that allulose, number one, is 12 times as expensive as sugar.
Oh, wow.
But it's coming down because demand is going up, and there are new methods for production that will reduce cost. And also, currently, the EFSA has said allulose is okay, but the Gulf Cooperation Council has not yet.
Okay.
So we're actually waiting to institute those. So lots of work yet to do.
Yeah. And is allulose excreted by the liver?
Kidney.
Kidney, sorry. Okay, yeah. And there aren't any local effects that we know of allulose?
Not that we know of.
Interesting. Bringing this full circle, I guess, to the non-nutritive assets of sugar. Have you come to the conclusion that it's not sugar per se, but the excess of sugar that is causing the issues?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we have a limited capacity to metabolize anything. Paracelsus, 1537, nothing is without poison. The dose determines the poison. Indeed, that is correct. I mean, in excess, water is toxic. In excess, oxygen is toxic. All right, but there's no abuse potential. With sugar, there is. With alcohol, there is. So when you're both toxic and addictive, you got a problem. So we need to recognize that fact. Any substance that is both toxic and addictive and ubiquitous and has negative impact on society, we regulate. Tobacco, alcohol, opioids, etc. Okay? For sugar, we have nothing. And, public health officials and politicians need to recognize this, inconvenient truth in order to be able to make headway. We have 1,500 years of alcohol control policy. Every country in the world has an alcohol control policy. We need sugar control policies.
Yeah, I agree. Look, we haven't scratched the surface when it comes to the genetic predispositions of laying down visceral fat across different backgrounds. There's a whole bunch of stuff I could ask you about the industry. We'll have to do this again at some point.
I suppose so.
But this has been a pleasure. I appreciate your work. I appreciate the vigor by which you're
It's very
bringing
kind
this.
of you.
Yeah.
I don't know any other way to be.
That's great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ruby.
Thank you, man. That was fab. Thank you. You're an absolute pro. If you enjoyed that video, you'll love the library of content that we have on thedoctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.